Welcome to this morning's panel. This is the first of 3 hybrid events this month to celebrate World Water Day. My name is Sapna Sharma, and I will be your moderator today. I'm a professor in the Department of Biology at York University in Toronto, Canada, and a limnologist. A limnologist is a scientist who studies inland waters such as lakes and rivers. In my case, I research the impacts of climate change on lakes worldwide. For example, I'm joining you today from sunny Toronto in the middle of winter, where we are forecasted to reach a high of plus 20 degrees Celsius or 68 Fahrenheit today. And this winter has been one of the warmest in recorded history. The impacts on our freshwater systems from climate change are diverse. And I wanted to take a moment to thank you to so many of you from joining us from all over the world. We have 91 countries represented in our audience today. We are thrilled that you are here to participate in our UNiTAR Global Water Academy panel today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our partners for this event across York University, UNiTAR, the United Nations Institute of Training and Research, the University of Victoria, and the University of Illinois at Urbana, Champaign. I would also like to take a moment in particular to thank all of the people from York University and UNiTAR who have been working tirelessly behind the scenes for all of their incredible support. I will start today's session with a land acknowledgement. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. You can visit the website native-land.ca to learn more about the Indigenous communities in the regions where you are from. Later today in the panel, we will learn about traditional communities across Africa, Asia, and Indigenous communities in Canada facing water insecurity. We highlight the need for equitable access to clean water. Next slide, please. Today, we aim to delve further into SDG Target 6.1, the aspirational goal of achieving universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. As it stands, over 2 billion people do not have safe access to clean water in their homes. The impacts of global environmental degradation, including climate change and land use change on freshwater security, are felt by communities around the world, limiting the availability, equitable access, and quality of freshwater supplies. This panel today aims to highlight some of the key challenges that water insecurity poses to communities around the world. We will also highlight how and why some regions in the world are experiencing freshwater declines, whereas other regions are experiencing increases in freshwater availability. Our aim is to highlight specific challenges to water access and subsequently identify strategies for water management and governance to improve universal access to clean water and sanitation. Next slide, please. We also want to hear and learn from you. We have assembled a global audience for a panel today from 91 countries, and we want to hear more about the water issues affecting your region. We will be planning, as UNiTAR Global Water Academy, we'll be planning on delivering many more panels and online courses throughout this year, and we would love to highlight some of the water issues faced around the world and talk about potential solutions or strategies to mitigate water insecurity. So we have this question for you today. What are the important water issues in your region? You can access this questionnaire in the link provided to you in the chat box, and we will summarize your answers at the end of the presentations before the question and answer period. We are looking forward to learning more about the water issues that affect your communities. Also, we welcome you to use the question and answer function to pose questions to us during the panel discussion as the speakers provide their remarks. And now this brings me to introducing our panel today. Today, we're going to hear from a diverse group of experts on water security. First, we'll be receiving welcoming remarks from Mr. Nikhil Seth, Executive Director of UNiTAR, and Dr. Rhonda Lenton, President and Vice Chancellor at York University. Next, we will hear from Governor Joseph Ole Lenku from Kenya, Professors Deborah McGregor, Kristian Dubrawski, and Jida Wong, who will articulate the challenges to water security in their communities and offer directions and solutions moving forward. Now, I will pass it over to my co-host, Mr. Julio Andrade. Mr. Andrade is the Associate Director of Project Development and Fundraising at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research and the Assistant Head of CFAL Global Network. He was also the former Deputy Mayor of the city of Malaga in Spain, among the many hats he wears. We are absolutely thrilled to be working with Mr. Andrade on the UNiTAR Global Water Academy, and I will pass it over to you, Julio, for introductions.
Thank you, Sapna. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Nikhil Seth, our United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Executive Director of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. Mr. Seth has had a long and illustrious career with the United Nations. Unfortunately, Mr. Seth is away on mission at the moment, but wanted to ensure that he could be able to present some remarks for our event.
Excellencies, esteemed panelists and guests, on behalf of UNiTAR, it is my pleasure in welcoming you here today for the first event of the year, UNiTAR's Global Water Academy, entitled Global Challenges in Water Access, Developing Governance Solutions and Applications for Water Scarcity Alleviation. The aim of our discussions today is twofold: to shed light on the specific challenges hindering water access, particularly in communities across Kenya and indigenous communities worldwide, and to identify strategies for effective water management and governance that can pave the way for universal access to clean water and sanitation. The impacts of global environmental degradation on freshwater security are profound and far-reaching. Communities around the world are challenged with limited availability, inequitable access, and compromised quality of freshwater supplies. These challenges are compounded by underlying social inequalities and environmental stressors, including the escalating frequency and severity of extreme weather events attributed to climate change. In the face of these challenges, it is imperative that we recognize the disproportionate burden borne by vulnerable populations, particularly women and girls. Without safe access to drinking water and sanitation in their homes, these communities are exposed to heightened threats of violence and exploitation. In consideration of these challenges today, we focus on contextualizing these issues by examining water access in communities across Kenya and indigenous communities globally. By understanding the unique socio-economic and environmental contexts in which these communities operate, we can tailor our intervention to meet their specific needs and challenges. In this manner, this panel aims to offer recommendations and solutions in the realm of water governance. Effective water management and governance are central to ensuring universal access to clean water and sanitation. By implementing transparent, inclusive, and participatory governance mechanisms, we can empower communities to take ownership of their water resources and ensure that sustainable management for future generations. As this discussion commences, let us remain mindful of our collective responsibility to leave no one behind. Access to clean water and sanitation is not just a fundamental human right. It is a prerequisite for realizing the full potential of individuals and communities, for achieving sustainable development, and for building a more just and equitable world for all. Through the power of dialogue and collaboration, together we can chart a course to address the challenges of water access so that every person, regardless of their background or circumstances, has access to clean water and sanitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Seth, for your remarks. Next, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Rhonda Lenton, President and Vice Chancellor of York University. President Lenton, who has been a fierce advocate and supporter of the UNiTAR Global Water Academy and the co-chaired advisory council, along with Mr. Nikhil Seth. Among her many accolades, Dr. Lenton has been named one of the top 100 most powerful women in Canada by the Women's Executive Network. And is today welcome. Dr. Lenton will also draw on some of her own research expertise in the fields of gender, family conflict, sexual harassment, and higher education. Welcome, President Lenton. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour and bonjour. I appreciate it may not be good morning everywhere, depending on where you're calling in from. It's a privilege for me to be part of this important discussion on water scarcity and access. And I would really like to acknowledge Mr. Nikhil Seth and the entire UNiTAR team for the support and the commitment that they have made in addressing the water crisis. I also want to take a moment to thank Professor Sapna Sharma. She is our professor in the Faculty of Science at York University. She's a York University chair. She's the inaugural director for the UNiTAR Global Water Academy. And she's been providing her leadership, her expertise, and also just thank her for organizing this important event today. I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk to you about York University. We are a leading international teaching and research university. We're based in Toronto, Canada. And our vision from the beginning has really been about providing a very broad socio-demographic of students with access to a high-quality, research-intensive learning environment at a university that is committed to the well-being of the communities that we serve. And that vision underscores everything that we do. And it is also very much a part of that vision that we center strengthening our impact on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And we've been recognized as an international leader in sustainability, relevant research, teaching, partnerships, campus practices, and we're continuing to build a strong foundation to become one of the most sustainable institutions in Canada. But we also understand that different countries are in very different situations when it comes to sustainability. And part of our responsibility is to work with partners around the world so that everyone has access to water. As we think about how we can do that and the role of universities about that. A key role for us at the university is to achieve net zero emissions by 2040, because we also understand our own role in minimizing and addressing issues such as climate change, for example. And our definition of sustainability is very broad. It includes ecological, social, economic dimensions, and we strive to achieve co-benefits that improve both human well-being and also ecological health. Today's panel offers such an important opportunity to discuss global solutions to a worldwide issue, water access and water scarcity, that incorporates an understanding of the factors that are impacting the variations across populations and countries, and how do we work better together. As Professor Sapna also mentioned that over 2 billion people currently lack access to clean water, and approximately 3.6 billion people, 46% of the world's population, lack adequate sanitation services. Some of my own research in the area of gender and family violence also talks about the far-reaching spillover effects of issues such as water access and water scarcity. It's often the case that women and girls are responsible, for example, for fetching water for their families, traveling by foot by as much as 10 hours per day. And without safe and reliable access to drinking water and to sanitation in their homes, women and girls can be disproportionately impacted, including, for example, my own areas of research around facing threats of sexual and domestic violence. According to UNICEF, in 2022, there was an 88% increase in household water insecurity in the areas of Kenya, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Somalia, exacerbating the risks for women and children. Safety and sanitation are also connected, as all the people on this call know, to overall health. Research shows that 1 million women and girls say that water, sanitation, hygiene services are their second most important demand for quality reproductive and maternal health after dignified and respectful care. Water scarcity and drought is also associated with increased mortality, especially among infants and children. We're also seeing how water scarcity contributes to mass migration. And Dadaab, currently home to over 370,000 refugees and asylum seekers, more than half of them children. There is a surge in refugees due to neighboring areas that are experiencing the worst drought in 40 years. And even here in Ontario, Canada, where you might not think that water is as much of an issue, despite being home to over 300,000 lakes and bordering 4 of the Laurentian Great Lakes, marginalized communities, particularly remote and Indigenous communities, still do not have access to clean water. We've seen, however, what can be achieved when we bring partners together for cross-border action. And as the academic lead of the UNiTAR Global Water Academy and a leading institution on water-related issues, York University is demonstrating and wants to continue to enhance our role and support other universities in generating the talent and undertaking the research that's needed to address these issues and strengthen our impact on the United Nations SDGs. Our strength in interdisciplinary research and water sustainability well equips York to lead the Water Academy with our partners and to build capacity and sustainable water management practices for the benefit of communities across the globe. So I would just like to conclude by thanking our panelists for their incredible efforts, for their commitment in advancing transdisciplinary research and education in water scarcity and water access and education. And we welcome the audience to join us at our next event on World Water Day on March 22nd. Thank you so much. Merci, miigwech.
Thank you very much, President Lenton. Now, His Excellency Joseph Ole Lenku, Governor of Kaijado County, Kenya. We are honored that Governor Joseph Ole Lenku is joining us at our panel today. He is the second governor of Kaijado County in Kenya and was the Cabinet Secretary for Interior and Coordination of National Government. Governor Ole Lenku is a graduate of the University of Nairobi, where he obtained his Master of Business Administration in Strategic Management and Bachelor of Commerce in Marketing. He has worked in different management positions for various hotels in Kenya and Tanzania. Governor Ole Lenku is also a Maasai and grew up in rural Kenya, herding goats and sheep, and still has a very large herd of cattle. We are thrilled that you could join us today, so you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. And let me take this opportunity to appreciate UNiTAR and York University for the partnership we have with York University that brought us to this platform. And I am the governor of Kaijado County, one of the 47 counties in Kenya. The Kenyan governance structure is such that there is a national government, which is like federal, and 47 county. Kaijado County is considered as a water-scarce county, and it is a semi-arid area of the Maasai people and indigenous people in the southern part of Kenya. Kaijado County has had a disproportionate negative effect of climate change on their water situation that has continued to aggravate the water problem in the county and cause severe competition between various competing interests. Kaijado County is also in the southern part of the city of Nairobi in Kenya. And many a times Kaijado is considered as the bedroom of Nairobi because many Nairobians seeking cheaper accommodation flock into Kaijado County. The water situation in Kaijado County is that the infrastructure is underdeveloped, and the main competing sources for water is the pastoralist water used by the indigenous people who are largely livestock keepers. As you heard earlier on, that I grew up herding cattle and goat. And this community has had to compete with the Nairobi population that is largely urbanized. But we are also seeing a number of people moving towards agriculture, dealing with irrigation. And part of Kaijado County is also wildlife rich, part of the Kenya. And therefore, there are competing interests for water for pastoralism, for urbanization, for agriculture, and even for human-wildlife conflict. The main water towers, we have 4 major water towers: Kilimanjaro water tower to the south. We have to the north what is called the Ngong Hills bordering Nairobi, and one to the west called Nkurman. In fact, the picture you are seeing there just shows how difficult the water situation is. Those are people queuing to get water. A household will ideally get like 20 liters of water for their use, for their cooking. And that tells you how difficult the water situation is here. As I said earlier, we have a myriad of challenges on water. This has been aggravated by climate change. We are now experiencing long spells of drought or long seasons without rain. And because our agriculture is rainfall-fed agriculture, and the livestock depend on pasture from the rainfalls, when the rains fail, a chain reactions begin where now competition for water becomes even more severe. As I indicated earlier, the challenge comes about because depending on the livelihoods of the community, like for those dependent on pastoralism, they will be fighting to get water, not only for their home use, but also for their livestock. For the wildlife, who constitute the backbone of our tourism, they compete with the human being, with livestock for water. The urban population coming from Nairobi and congesting the northern part of the county also lack important water infrastructure like sewerage system, pipe water for their homes, and therefore these continue to we have had people finding alternative livelihoods to survive, because of losing their livestock during long drought spell. People are now moving to sand harvesting to sell sands for construction in Nairobi. Others are going to charcoal burning, both of which just aggravate the difficult climate change situation. So out of this, we have had as a county to introduce a water governance structure where we have what we call the water services providers. And these are given various jurisdiction of county space to manage their water. These water service providers are supported by the county government. They are the ones that develop the water sources, try and pipe water to the community, try to harness the rainwater harvesting, do boreholes for some communities. And so the governance structure is done by these water service providers. The county government provides the legislative framework that guides their work. They provide little resources for the development of the water sources, drilling of boreholes, putting up water pans or small dams. And the future for these communities is to consider creating dams for rainwater harvesting, but also leveraging on technology like solar to pump water through solarization to the communities. Currently, they use diesel-powered generators that are very expensive and sometimes use electricity that becomes unaffordable, and many a time the utility company will do the disconnection. So we are, as a county, are a testimony of the negative effect of climate change and how indigenous communities have suffered disproportionate share of negative climate change. And this has disrupted their livelihoods, their pastoralism. It has disrupted their lifestyle. It has even disrupted education, and therefore creates a chain of problems that really affecting those communities. We are seeking for partnership to develop our infrastructure for water. We know our water towers have sufficient water if the infrastructure was there. Communities are resilient and easy adaptable to new technologies. And so we are here to give information that there are really some vulnerable indigenous communities that are seeking global help to address the water challenges. I once more, on behalf of my county and my community, the Maasai people, thank you for giving us this platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you kindly, Governor Ole Lenku, for sharing the challenges and opportunities of water insecurity in your region. We appreciate your time today. We're going to move over now to Canada to hear about Indigenous communities in Canada and the issues of water security that they face in a land of more than 9 million lakes and over 20% of the world's freshwater supply. And to that end, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Deborah McGregor, who is an associate professor at the Osgoode Hall Law School at York University and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice. Professor McGregor works at the forefront of Indigenous environmental justice research, as well as Indigenous research theory and practice. I pass it over to you, Professor McGregor.
Thank you for that introduction and the remarks before me. Sadly, I have to say that a lot of that situation that was described, the infrastructure, governance issues, are very similar to what Indigenous peoples face in Canada, particularly First Nations, and I'll discuss why in particular First Nations. Because one would think, as Sharma pointed out, like Canada has this lots of water. We wouldn't expect there to be water insecurity, but there is. And I wanted to comment also on the president's remarks as well. Like I grew up in my community, so I'm in Anishinaabe from White River First Nation in the Great Lakes, and my job was to go get water from the lake, and I had to go up a hill. So that's how I grew up, getting water directly, like surface water, from weirdly McGregor Bay. So and then later on, when the Great Lakes started to become contaminated, you couldn't drink the water anymore, and you need the infrastructure and a water treatment plant. But that's how I grew up, and quite frankly, many communities still get water from that place. So with that, I'm going to share a screen so you do not have to go on Zoom and just look at me the whole time. Show you some images. Hopefully you can see this screen, and I will try to time myself so I don't take too much time. So I just wanted to point out that water is like anybody else, any other group of people on the planet. Water is very central, but to Anishinaabe, which I am, it's basically the life of the people. And we've always been I think we look at our relationship to water as a coexistence with water. We don't think about governing water or managing water. We have a different ontology of water that I'll talk about as part of this presentation. Those are just images of young people, just depicting a little bit about what we rely on water for food, for fishing, but also for our cultural and spiritual and well-being needs as well, which often isn't considered in how water is thought about in terms of governance and management. So Indigenous peoples in Canada have been using water for thousands of years, and we had knowledge systems, our own science, our own governance systems, and our own laws about how we would relate to water appropriately to ensure that people will flourish, and so will water. And we also, as part of our knowledge systems, a central part of it comes, what are our duties and obligations and responsibilities to water? So that's how we would think about our knowledge and relationship to water. So water is life. This is from the research that I've done in relation to water. I realized for 25 years or more is what's a consistent theme that's come up from elders and knowledge holders is that water is life. Without water, we would not survive. Doesn't matter how rich you are, how poor you are, we will not survive without water. recognized also in the human rights to water as part of the United Nations, but really concern around water in Canada. A catalyst for that was the Walkerton inquiry, which I don't have time to get into, but the people were contaminated, wells were contaminated in Southern Ontario, and people died, and Canada realized, despite the abundance of water and clean water, that we had a problem in terms of ensuring safe drinking water supply to basically Canadian citizens. This was a problem in First Nation communities for decades. Some communities have been on drinking water advisories and boil water advisories for decades. And so water's always been a concern, but Indigenous peoples in Canada, in many respects, have their concerns and issues have not made front page news until recently. And so those concerns weren't dealt with. And I'll talk about why that is. It's also, I hate to say, legal in terms of what we refer to as a regulatory gap in terms of how water is protected in First Nation communities. So everybody here on this, in this event today knows this, that there is a water crisis. This comes from the World Water Report, will be coming out next week, I guess it's next week. And, but it's also a water crisis in First Nation communities. And it was pointed out in the presentation before, climate change is going to exacerbate this. It's just going to become more challenging over time. But now as we speak, people are experiencing these challenges in many ways in a life and death kind of situation. Oops, see if I can get it to move. Okay. So I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous people in the world, but one of the ways that I try to understand how Indigenous peoples around the world think about water, is it similar or different? Of course, Indigenous peoples have different experiences, culture, knowledge, laws, places that they live, and challenges that they face. But these are ones that I pulled out from different water declarations, Indigenous peoples coming together, many different nations around the world, and agree on these principles. Thinking about water as a sacred and sustaining all life. Water is a source of material, cultural, and spiritual life. And Indigenous peoples also celebrate World Water Day on the 22nd, but celebrate it more in terms of recognizing the other dimensions of water that brings to our well-being, but which I often refer to as a more holistic perspective on water, or a different ontology of water. So the way that Indigenous peoples experience water in Canada isn't unusual in terms of Indigenous peoples around the world in other places, but of course they can speak for themselves. So I also like to point out the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also recognizes the rights of Indigenous peoples, the unique and distinct rights that we have in relation to water, and our responsibility also to future generations, obligations that we have, and duties and responsibilities to ensure that future generations have access to safe, I wouldn't just say for drinking water, for all the things that we need water for, that water needs to be well. So coming into some of the challenges that we're facing, and it's similar to what's been pointed out before, and here I just say nation states, but more specifically, I'm speaking about the Canadian context, that Indigenous peoples, as I pointed out, were governing and caring for water for thousands of years in the Great Lakes. I'm actually dialing in from Toronto and not my home community. And so different laws and jurisdiction then got imposed upon the jurisdiction and laws that had existed here for thousands of years. And that's been a huge challenge for Indigenous peoples. We can no longer express ourselves, assert our own laws in terms of taking care of water. We're become vulnerable to other people's laws in terms of how they understand water and how they want water to be governed and managed. And from our point of view, it's been grossly mismanaged in terms of how we experience the impact of water-related decisions in Canada, often made by provinces. Just in terms of, in the Canadian context, how jurisdiction is divided up between federal and provincial governments. So it's an important part of this conversation is also historical ongoing colonialism. A lot of the Canada was colonizing Indigenous peoples, and it was a very deliberate efforts to undermine Indigenous laws and governance structures and relationships to lands and waters. And so what we have and the way that many Indigenous people experience this is we have a conflict of laws. We have our own laws in relation to water. We have our own governance structures. There's a lack of respect for our own knowledge and science around how we care for water, for even how we understand and construct water. It undermines our jurisdiction in terms of how we would prefer to take care of water, what we think water needs and what people need. It's severed many of the relationships that Indigenous peoples have with water, either through relocation or in some cases, communities have to be evacuated due to drinking water crisis concerns in their communities. You can no longer relate to water in the same way. And there's what we call a regulatory gap. So provincially in Canada, there's a lot of, there's water protection, governance and management and a legal structure and a policy structure. In First Nation communities, there isn't. And I'll talk a little bit later when we have a conversation and question and answer on what some solutions are. So there isn't any of those same kind of mechanisms to protect water in First Nation communities, and it's referred to as a regulatory gap. So for example, in Ontario, we have the Clean Water Act, but First Nations are under federal jurisdiction, so it doesn't apply there, so we don't have that. There are efforts to try to fill that gap, but right now there's a regulatory gap. So First Nations are in a situation where we're almost set up to not have the same protection as anybody else in Canada. So there's been various issues raised by First Nations people around Canada. Saskatchewan, I'll talk about in a minute, in a constant state of emergency, usually every year. It'll be interesting to see what happens this year, because this community was relocated to a place, was relocated by Government of Canada into a floodplain. So every year it floods, people experience health concerns, and then they have to be evacuated out. And this is a flying community. You can't get there through roads. So they have to get flown out until the immediate issue becomes resolved. Other First Nations under constant boil water advisories. In a nutshell, Indigenous communities don't enjoy the same water quality and protections as their non-Indigenous counterparts. And it's set up that way constitutionally. So this is just an example showing you where Saskatchewan is. So Saskatchewan is this community up here in the James Bay. It's a flying community. And this is just a picture of the people in the community pointing out the issues that they're facing. I think finally, there's been negotiations between the First Nation and the Government of Canada to relocate the community to where they would rather be to prevent this ongoing problem year after year after year of this community being evacuated. So this is this community's reality for a very long time. This is another example of water insecurity that has colonial roots in it. So this is, and there's actually a number of communities, but two of them in particular around Shoal Lake in Northwestern Ontario. So their community provides water to the city of Winnipeg in another province. And so water, there's an aqueduct and water is shipped down to Winnipeg so that they can have clean water. But these communities do not. So essentially they're providing clean water to somebody else, to a city, and they themselves do not have clean water. So Shoal Lake 40 they were almost like a remote community, even though there's a major highway close by, because you couldn't get there. So gaining access to water when the Shoal Lake was contaminated and you can't drink that water anymore through basic cottagers and other processes. And then Shoal Lake 39 recently got a water treatment plant. So they had to deal with this situation through infrastructure, which came only recently. And in the meantime, for over 100 years, their water in this lake has been provided to the city of Winnipeg, but they themselves didn't have it. So there's these sort of gross inequalities as well. So this community has to bring water in, even though their water right outside their door is providing water to somebody else, because the city of Winnipeg can treat it through their water treatment facilities. So this is there's lots of stories, but I thought I would point those two out because to me they're obvious. So nation states and Indigenous peoples, we have competing sovereignty over lands and waters, and we see often these other laws not really working for us, or even if they even apply to us, if they have protection and conservation components to them. And we see that the waters have been mismanaged. So here I want to talk. I'm sorry, rushing through this, but I think this is important because I see it also as part of one of the I don't know if I go so far as to say conflict, but tension that exists in terms of how do we approach water in Canada. And there's opportunities to really there's openings to think about water a bit differently than just water is H2O. So some of water ontologies in Anishinaabe, we say nebe. So we see water as a relative. So the way that you would take care of water is how you would take care of a relative. Women and girls have a special connection to water. So there's a gendered component to how water is understood and approached and cared for, and in Indigenous communities, particularly Anishinaabe communities. And we have to be safe with water as well, because if you don't take care of water, let's say humans contaminate it, flood it, and dam it, then water can also cause harm because we've contaminated. And if we drink it, then we're going to get sick. So we have to ensure that water has to be safe. So water is also understood as having its own agency in our legal structure. And when we talk about solutions, I'll point to some examples of where that work is occurring in the Canadian context. So as I pointed out, water is more than just H2O. So you can look up how water is defined in the dictionary. It has a very specific definition, and mostly what we think about it as being water. But water is more than just drinking water. It also has non-material, spiritual needs, relationship aspects to it that are really important to Indigenous people. And water insecurity impacts that relationship when you can no longer trust water because it's been contaminated. So you can't relate to water in the same way. It's no longer a life-giving force. It can harm you. So we do have laws, policy, and knowledge to contribute to broader society in terms of how we can reframe even how water is actually understood, how to fill this regulatory gap that First Nations experience. So there isn't this basically legal way of continuing the insecurity that First Nations face, or this injustice that Indigenous peoples face. So there are efforts across the country to try to address that. But similar to, as pointed out before, a lot of this is a lot of communities don't have infrastructure. In my community, we didn't have a water treatment plant until relatively recently. And we're like 5-hour drive from Toronto, so we're not even remote like Saskatchewan. But at the same time, people still want to be able to relate to water in the way that we had, because you want your health and your spirituality needs met in order to continue to be Anishinaabe people, because it's very much also tied to one's identity. So I know I went through that fairly quickly, but hopefully I gave you a sense of some of the issues that First Nations and Indigenous peoples face. It isn't just the quality of the water and access to it. It's actually how you even understand water, and then how you relate to it, and how it ensures your well-being. And then we have innovative solutions that we're working on to try to influence broader policy and legal frameworks in a way that brings different knowledge systems together to try to address the crisis literally that we are all facing, but some people, of course, in equitable ways. I will stop there and thank you. Thank you for listening, and looking forward to the conversations and questions, in 20 minutes or so. Shimigwech.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That was very enlightening, and I think you managed to effectively cover hundreds of years of history and governance and laws and treaties to get us to explain very concisely the situation that Indigenous communities are facing today. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. And so now we are going to hear from Professor Kristian Dubrawski, Assistant Professor and Canada Research Chair in Water Sustainability for Indigenous and Rural Communities, Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Victoria. He is a specialist in water quality and technology, intersecting with community and ecological health, and leads the Community Water Innovation Lab. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Dubrawski.
Thank you, Sapna. Thank you, Deborah. Just going to share my screen. Okay. I hope to touch on a few points that Deborah made, because I think it's really tied into what to do next. So my name is Kristian. I'll leave my email address there if you have any questions. But I just want to acknowledge the land I'm on in Victoria, BC, and ally with resurgence movements of the Wasanic, Lekwungen, and Weymouth peoples. So I've got 3 lessons from my experience on the ground. So really it's on the ground and field experiences. My background's engineering. I work with my hands and kind of try to think with my heart. But let's share a little bit about me. I did a PhD with Rezo. For better or worse, it wasn't the best research program to actually address engineering. Again, this is part of my critique of Western worldviews, sort of creating conflict with an indigenous worldview. More on that later. I worked with water health. I worked with arsenic challenges in Bangladesh, specific acute biological water causing diarrhea. It's a huge, one of the largest contributions to mortality in the world. I had a company called Ecological Water. I started to think about, well, what's the broader connection? I worked for McKinsey around nature in their sustainability practice. I worked for the federal government, and then I did some work on inclusive innovation. So just to give you a context of where I'm coming from. These are my views and my lessons, so please also take it with a grain of salt. I am smack dab in the middle of the privileged circle, and I don't know everything, and I'm certainly still learning how to be a better researcher and a better citizen. Okay, I did a postdoc at Stanford and then got a job here at UVic a couple of years ago. Okay, the first lesson I have is this like global threat, which is on top of a lot of our minds, and then how do we kind of alchemize that into local action? And so these are, again, just my lessons of what I've seen worked. And what I find, what my kids find is like you wake up believing in the world you find yourself in. And so that's important for me to not convey a message of fear, which I'm about to jump into some of the realities of where the world finds herself right now, into, okay, what do we do about it? How do we shift from that very scary world kind of world-eating machine into, okay, how do we create stewardship? How do we create local love? A lot of what I'm trying to do right now is how do people fall in love with a watershed? And let me get to that. So, right, this is from The Great Acceleration. And so the point I want to make here is that water insecurity is not a cause in its own. Water is neither created nor destroyed. And a lot of the research says there actually is probably enough water if if managed sustainably for 10 billion people. So it's really a byproduct. Water insecurity is a byproduct of all the other metrics of the Great Acceleration. And you can point to exponential technology, whether that's agriculture, domestication, or industrial revolution, or AI. Regardless of the point, it's here and has caused things. Maybe you've seen the planetary boundaries framework, and maybe you've seen the IPAD equation, and I teach this in a grad level course. And I bring this up at UNiTAR because this can often be used as, it's kind of like as racist implications, like, oh, the problem is population, the problem is Bangladesh or India. But actually, when we actually put some numbers, this isn't a real equation, and I'm not going to get into this. This is its own field. But when we start to think about the actual numbers, and there are units, it's not a full quantitative equation. But if we imagine today, we're at 1 for population affluence and technology, and in 2050, we're a little higher. But actually, population doesn't have as much of an impact as one might think. It's actually more the affluence, so people in the global north who are just essentially consuming more, and the environmental efficiency, so to speak, isn't actually decreasing, in my opinion. It's not like we're shifting immediately to circular economies. And so even kind of that's my implication. We're still looking by 2050 more impact, twice as much as what it is today. That's just a reality. And so we need to adapt. And that's why I particularly like the SDGs, and that's why I'm here. So I'm grateful to this community, and also thinking about water security in this context as a byproduct of these sort of non-regenerative systems, and perhaps regenerative systems as being a bit of a solution to creating water security. Okay, so how do we do this? Again, just like my colleague Deborah mentioned, we can put indigenous worldviews into a Western context. And, you know, that's something I think about a lot, because if you look at a watershed, a Western context might say, well, what's the value of a watershed? You know, maybe there's some fish in there, maybe some water, some clean water, maybe it's 50 grand, 100 grand. But if you start thinking about actually what's going on here, and these are called ecosystem services, and it's not the perfect model because it tries to put a number, a dollar sign behind these things, but there's a lot more going on here. And we can, in some ways, put that into Western decision-making tools to support policy, to support governance, and say, actually, there's a lot more, there's a lot of co-benefits into watershed stewardship. So one thing I work with is communities, and like people who steward watersheds, especially small watersheds. It's incredible how important things like cultural services are. Like, how do you fall in love with a creek? That was an honors student, Amanda, who wrote that. And I find it fascinating that you know, there's a lot of lessons there that really we can turn that global threat into local stewardship. And that actually has probably as much of an impact as sort of the top-down policy and governance, but policy and governance can facilitate that local stewardship. Okay, this again I found in my work with Réseau, work with First Nations communities. I would go to a community and talk about water, and they would say, it's actually, you know, it's actually the fish, or it's the health. It's not just the water. You can't reduce it to any one thing. And me in kind of Western conditioning, I had a lot to learn there. And so for me, thinking about innovation, how do we actually incorporate respectfully, without appropriating anything here, into a more holistic worldview? And so that's in some ways my own work as well. How do I develop a better relationship with the land so I can teach it? One thing we're doing again is we think about nature-based planning. Again, this can be a euphemism, or it can also be an effective way of looking at global impact and saying, actually, we can increase watershed security and we can contribute to nature. So just a few of the things I've worked on, the East Kolkata wetlands, which is kind of a product of colonialism, but also an incredible means of supporting a large proportion of protein of fish for the city of Kolkata. I think I see Imran on the participant panel, who's also worked in this field. This is the largest wetland restoration in North America. And it's run by the Tunaha Nation, and the PhD student I'm supervising, Isaac, he is working on this wetland. And again, if you looked at, this is for water security, the wells go dry, but if you recharge the water, if you recharge the groundwater, and you increase fish production, and you increase sort of cultural and spiritual ecosystem services, for lack of a better word, there's a real kind of co-benefit to this. I just want to highlight co-benefits with nature, not kind of this reductionist. Sometimes the most important thing to do is just safe water. And sometimes long-term thinking, global threat thinking, we think of these holistic nature-based solutions that work for nature and for water security for society. I'm going to run through these because I'm trying to be good on time, but the Kharez system in the Middle East, again, very interesting nature-based solution, and clam gardens from the Pacific Northwest here. Again, nature, human interactions. Okay, starts in the innovation process, and I think this is where I want to highlight in governance, is that the Western worldview is very reductionist. Okay, we do this and that and this, and a more ecological worldview, in many cases, it's an indigenous worldview, is all about the connections. And again, so it's not just water, and we can innovate around that. And so I've done some work on decolonizing the innovation process. So we start to look at benefits between generations and benefits within the present generation. And my work with First Nations communities has been around, okay, flipping the governance model to just incorporating communities into water decision-making. And how does that work? It works through relationship. It works through dialogue. It works through figuring out What are real communities? Is it just the water, or is it the salmon? Is it is it health? Is it, you know, the spiritual connection to water? And that just helps the innovation process before you show up with something, a new well, a technology, etc. Okay, something that I'm trying to look at research. This is one of our papers around, okay, now how do we innovate in nature-based solutions from a real equity perspective? Again, benefits within this generation and between generations, not to appropriate Indigenous worldviews, but the 7-generation thinking, I think, is something that governance, you know, that should be primary, not thinking about quarterly reports, but rather, okay, let's think a few generations out. So these innovation processes are 100 years in the making. Okay, key levers. I just want to finish up in a couple minutes. So again, water insecurity is a byproduct of the Great Acceleration, and water security is a byproduct of regenerative systems. And part of regenerativity is around equity. And the lever there is to share power and get out of the way of wisdom lineage holders. If someone like Deborah was in charge of water laws, I would be so grateful, because that's the worldview, I think, that both addresses more of a local stewardship model as well as a global threat model, but it always starts local. And that's the case in the Maasai. That's the case in the Kharez system in Afghanistan. That's been my experience. That's what I've seen. Sometimes just get out of the way, or fund it from a research perspective. My point 2 is facilitate funding and research for medium scale on the ground regenerative systems. And, you know, for me, like, to actually say, hey, this is working in the Maasai, and here's the lessons for everyone else. That's hard kind of research funding to come by. And it's really about system management. It's not one thing. It's not just water. And the Hopi saying is, does it grow corn? And that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kristian. That was amazing. It was really refreshing to hear about the importance of community, our local lands, our waters, and the importance of stewardship of what we can preserve locally. You know, that's, I think, a very important lesson that you've shared, in the importance of community and interrelationships, and all of us here trying in our own way to leave the world a better place than where we came, and using our knowledge systems and our relationships within our community to improve water security. And you also highlight, with this Hopi saying, the importance of food, right? Water and food security are so intrinsically linked. And some of the questions that we're receiving from the audience really highlights those issues. We need water to survive. We need food to survive. And those two are intrinsically linked to one another. So thank you for sharing your insights and your expertise. So now we are moving to a more global stage, where we're going to hear from Professor Jida Wong from the University of Illinois, Urbana, Champaign, who is a broadly trained physical geographer and hydrologist. His research focuses on surface water abundance and dynamics, particularly in lakes, reservoirs, and wetlands from around the world. He studies how water is stored and how lakes interact with their river systems, the cryosphere. The cryosphere is a word to say related to ice and snow. The carbon cycle and human water management using innovative methodologies. So thank you for joining us, Professor Wong, and I will pass it over to you to share some of your expertise.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for this kind invitation. So yeah, let me share my slides. All right, so can everybody see my slide at this moment?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's really my pleasure to be invited to this UNiTAR presentation opportunity. And this is, I think, as a scientist, it's really a precious opportunity to talk about our funding and basically reaching to the general public to see how our funding can perhaps provide solutions and added values to the community. So yeah, so for my talk, I will basically focus on how the Earth observing satellite system as a whole is able to give us a broader idea of how the water quantity has been changing, and then what the water dynamics indicate for socioeconomic implications, and eventually seeking for some of the management solutions. So I want to start with this general picture. So this is a picture that I took about 10 years ago when I was traveling to the northernmost territory of the US, which is called Utkavik. It's basically early settlement of the Inupiat people. And the old name is called Barrow. So when the airplane was descending there, I see this broad horizon of this so-called thermokarst lakes. There are millions of them. And then I was wondering how many are there, and then how they are changing with climate change, because the permafrost are thawing, causing the lakes to expand and then shrink, and also emitting carbon cycle, and how we can actually improve the observations of them and what that indicates to water abundance and access, and eventually climate change as well. So I want to briefly talk about how our mass conserved hydrosphere or water cycle has been changing in the past 2 or 3 decades since we have more Earth observing satellite missions. So I want to briefly start with understanding some of the emerging global trends in the terrestrial water storage. So basically, this is a picture depicted by the so-called Gravity and Recovery and Climate Experiment, or GREE satellite. So this satellite basically observes how the Earth gravity field has been changing. The Earth gravity field is changes because of the Earth mass is also changing. If you exclude the mass changes contributed by solid Earth, most of the mass changes is caused by the water motion movements from place to another place. We know that the water cycle in our Earth is mass conserved. We're not losing water to the universe, neither do we gain water from the universe. So it's all about spatial temporal variability among the water system. Some places are losing water. So some of the major signal includes the ice sheet melting in Greenland, or some of the glacier retreat in Juneau Glacier and Patagonia, and and some other areas as well. So, and these are mostly caused by the recent global warming. And some other regions that we also have water loss includes some of the water depletion, such as in the Central Eurasia, causing the lake to shrink, and also the groundwater and sustainable groundwater abstraction in the aquifers, such as the Persian aquifers, Arabian Peninsula aquifers, and the aquifers in Sahara, and also the Central Valleys as well. And then also the northeastern part of the northern plain in China. It's where I grew up originally. And these are mostly caused by unsustainable human water consumption, causing the integrated terrestrial water storage that integrate both surface water, soil moisture, and groundwater to be completed. And then you also have the contribution coming from more transient forces caused by climate variability. Example includes some of the major droughts in the central and southern part of the Great Plains of the US, which is actually in a dipole pattern with the water gain in northern part of the Great Plains, leading to Saskatchewan and part of Canada. And then also some of the major drought recently in eastern part of Brazil, which is basically in dipole pattern, basically in contrast with the water gain in the Amazon basin, and also the water loss in western part of Australia, and a little bit water gain in eastern part of Australia. And similarly, in southern part of Africa, and a little bit water gain in the Namib Desert recently. And then, of course, the transient forces are really in a rapid changes, so on an interannual cycles. So this kind of terrestrial water storage changes gave us a holistic picture of how the water have been changing. But if you look at this pattern, what we find is that some of the regions that are already very arid and water stressed, they're already lacking water, are actually also experiencing a greater pace of water loss. So in this recent study that we conducted, so basically we partitioned the global land mass, excluding Greenland and Antarctic, so into several major climate zones. So most of the areas is categorized as humid zones, contributing about 50% of the land mass. And the other 50% is partitioned into dry, subhumid, semi-arid, arid, and hyper-arid. So basically the takeaway message is that in all of these zones, there is a unanimous total terrestrial water storage decline at about 300 gigatons per year. Just to give us a little bit concept of how much 300 gigatons per year is. 1 gigaton basically is 1 billion cubic meters. 300 gigatons per year of water loss is equivalent to almost half of the annual water use in the United States. So we're losing so much water every single year. And then, but if we partition into different climate zones, and then we calculate the water depletion intensity, basically the water depletion rate per unit area, we see that so each of these arid zones, even though they have limited water resources in total, is actually having a greater pace of water intensity loss per unit area. So combining these 4 zones and multiplied by the area, we end up having a little bit more water loss in the arid zones than the entire humid zone, even though the arid zones have limited water resources. So this is basically the takeaway message, right? The average water depletion intensities in the all dry arid zones exceed or at least equal to that of the humid zones. And basically more than 50% of the total water mass loss come from the drylands. And within the dryland itself, the area of significant water loss actually exceeds the significant water gain by over 40%. So, and then the message is that, so what is causing the water changes in each of the zones between humid zones and arid zones? So then we try to disentangle the contribution from climate change and basically mostly global warming and climate variability, basically at the interannual or interdecadal scale, and also direct human water consumption. So based on our hydrological model approach, so we're able to see that in the arid zones, most of the water loss comes from the warming-induced glacier loss. And then the precipitation is mostly coming from climate variability, only contribute to a small fraction of the changes. Direct human activities in the humid zones contribute to limited impacts. But in the global drylands, it is where the most of the contribution of water loss come from the direct human activities, so accounting for 94 gigatons per year, while precipitation coming from climate variability is actually contributing more humidity to the arid regions. And glacier loss also contribute a small proportion of the dryland water loss, but it is the direct human activities, such as from irrigation, that contributes the substantial dominant proportion of the water loss. And that's why we say there is a divergent causes of water decline between drylands and humid regions. So to be a little bit more specific, so what exact human activities are contributing to the widespread water loss in the drylands? So we basically use, again, a remote sensing, satellite-based remote sensing approach in combination with modeling to depict that. So in a global drylands, so there's our widespread distribution of hotspots of human-induced water losses. So, and this gray boundary shows the global drylands. So in this global drylands, particularly, right, so we partition further into different sources of human-induced water losses. So ranging from vegetation canopies, from lake consumption, and wetland drainage, groundwater, and so on and so forth. We find out that in global drylands, where human-induced water consumption are very widespread, and sustainable groundwater depletion, so explain almost 70% of the net water loss in drylands. And the water completion in drylands actually also account for almost 90% of the total groundwater depletion in this entire world, further highlighting, the impacts of unsustainable irrigation and human activities in dominating the entire terrestrial water storage decline, particularly in the already arid and water-stressed regions then. So I want to also introduce another study that we recently done, talking mostly about the recent trends of the world's largest lakes and reservoirs. So lakes and reservoirs are very important liquid surface water storage. They account for almost 90% of the surface liquid water storage. So understanding how the lakes and reservoirs are changing basically indicates how our most directly accessible water resources have been changing. So we basically combine all the possible satellite observations since the satellite altimetry era basically is the satellite that is able to capture the water level changes in the past 3 decades or so. We reveal that we study basically the world's largest 2,000 largest lakes, including about 1,200 natural lakes and also about 800 artificial reservoirs. We're trying to map their detailed time series at a bi-monthly or 1 to 2 monthly time step. We're able to review how the water storage in each of these lakes are changing. So, and this is the general pattern for that. So the takeaway message that, so the colder color represents lake storage gain, and warmer color represents lake storage loss. And the darker, warmer color means storage loss in the natural lakes, and darker cold color means water gain in the natural lakes. And the lighter warm color means water loss in the natural lakes, and the lighter cold color means water gain in the reservoirs. And the purple colors basically means some of the water gain because of newly constructed and newly filled reservoirs, particularly in the developing countries such as China and India and some part of South America and Africa as well. So even though, so we studied 2,000 lakes of different types, we found out there's a widespread decline of water storage loss in the world's largest lakes and reservoirs. So in total, we have 53% of them in significant storage decline, statistically speaking. So they sum up to be a net decline of about 21.5 gigatons per year. That is almost about, in an understandable way, about 8 million Olympic standard swimming pools. We're basically losing 8 million of Olympic swimming pools per year only from the surface water and particularly from lakes and reservoirs as a whole. There are also water gains throughout the world, but they're mostly contributed by some of the newly filled reservoirs. And then in some of the sporadic regions, such as the Tibetan Plateau, which is experiencing net precipitation, and northern plains, northern Great Plains of North America, also experiencing more precipitation there as well. So if we summarize the global lake storage changes, we can have several takeaway messages. So we partition the global surface into humid regions and arid regions. For each region, we have lakes from all of the types, which is in dark color, or natural lakes, which is in blue, and reservoirs, which is in red, which is in green. In green, overall, we see that there's a divergent storage trend between natural lakes and reservoirs. But overall, the natural lake decline dominates the pattern. And then we also try to test if there's a dry area gets drier or wet area gets wetter kind of paradigm. So in the arid region, we do see that dry area seems to get drier in terms of lake surface storage changes, but mostly it's explained by the declining natural lakes. Reservoir trend stays pretty much constant within the arid region. But for the humid regions, our humid regions get wetter. So overall, the trend, yes, but that is mostly explained not by gaining water in the natural lakes. So basically it's almost negligible, but because of newly filled or constructed reservoirs in many parts of the world, basically giving us the contrast between human struggling of water management in building reservoirs, while at the same time with the declining natural lakes, at least in some of the largest ones. Then we're trying to unfold the story for each of these major lakes. We're trying to attribute the story changes to 3 first-order factors. The first one is global warming, which is more secular. We have increasing temperature pretty much constantly. And then we also try to disentangle them with more natural variability that is more transient at an interannual time scale. And then also from direct human water consumption upstream. So overall, for the declining natural lakes, which is the upper part of the panel, we saw that almost 25% of the declining natural lakes can be attributed to mostly human water consumption upstream, or caused by increasing temperature, therefore increasing potential evaporation. So even though they account for 1/4 of the number, the total water loss accounts for more than half of the water loss. So in other words, we can say more than half of the total water loss in the natural lakes is explained by either human water consumption or global warming, which are both considered to be more secular and enduring factors. But for the natural water volume gains, they are the minority in terms of water volume, mostly explained by increasing precipitation, likely caused by some of the transient factors of climate variability. So if we also summarize the attributions in different factors for each of the three, for arid region, humid region, and then for global regions, for both natural lakes and reservoirs, and then we can take away some of the messages. Basically, so the net water storage loss in natural lakes is largely contributed to global warming or increasing evapotranspiration or human water consumption, as indicated by some of these factors here for natural lakes. But for global reservoirs, so reservoirs are being filled in the past 3 decades or so. So in our 2,000 largest lakes and reservoirs, we identify new reservoirs, very gigantic new reservoirs, to a number about 180 or so. So even we are building some of the gigantic mega reservoirs to store water to combat against water scarcity. So some of the existing reservoirs are basically experiencing sedimentation, which caused the water storage to be lost. So by counteracting both of them, right, adding them up, we found out that overall reservoirs are gaining water, but however, the sedimentation issues in the existing reservoirs largely offset the water storage fueling in some of the new reservoirs, basically telling us again, so when we are managing water resources from the reservoirs, we also are trying to understand the existing reservoirs are losing capacity because of the larger scale, catchment scale, hydrogeomorphic processes of sedimentation as well. So, and then we're linking the water storage changes in the global lakes into population. So we're trying to calculate the global population percentage that are residing in some of the significant water loss basins. So we are associating the percentage of population with lake changes into several sectors. The first is the basins with freshwater decline. So basically, they are the basins where there are freshwater lakes and the lakes are in significant decline. On a global scale, that accounts for more than 20% of the global population, almost a quarter of them. So in other words, where 1 out of 4 to 5 people in the world is residing in a basin with decreasing freshwater supplies from global lakes. So most of them come from humid regions, which makes sense because every region has less freshwater lakes. But then we are also attributing to the environmental degradation. This mostly refers to the basins with saline lakes. Even though saline lakes are not directly potable water storage, water resources, they play a very important role for the local ecosystem and limnological functions. And then the shrinkage of the saline lakes will also cause some of the health issues, such as the exposed dust from the toxic salt dust from the littoral zone of the lakes, for example. And then basically we have about 10% of the global population potentially impacted by the shrinking saline lakes. And then we're also trying to calculate how many people are potentially impacted by the reducing hydropower generation, mostly in the basins with substantially large hydropower dams. About 15% of the global population are associated with water storage loss, either because of climate change issues or because of the sedimentation-induced storage loss in the reservoirs. Eventually, if we sum up each of the any of the 3 factors, we have basically a quarter of the world's population resides in a basin with significant water decline, with pretty much comparable percentage between both arid regions and humid regions. So eventually, I just want to briefly talk about, even though we are having a very fantastic constellation of the Earth observing systems, our capability of understanding storage changes or discharge for smaller water bodies are limited. But now we're also in the so-called golden age of Earth observing satellite period. We are having added new generations Earth observing satellites that are able to broaden our horizon of observing more fine detailed water resource dynamics, which help us to better understand the attribution and seek better conservation and management. So among all the satellites missions that are being launched, I just want to quickly emphasize one of the satellites, which is called Surface Water and Ocean Topography, or SWOT for short, satellite mission. So SWOT satellite mission was launched about a couple of years ago, and this is how the satellite looks like before launch. And this satellite is a joint mission from NASA and connects basically the space agency from a space agency from France and the Canadian Space Agency and also United Kingdom Space Agency. So this satellite is really revolutionary and pathfinder satellite because it is the first sensor that is able to measure fine detailed water extents and also water levels at the same time. In a spatially continuous way. So once we're able to observe the water extents and areas at the same time and levels at the same time, we can use that measurements to derive water storage changes in lakes and reservoirs, and also very importantly, the running water stream flow and discharge in global rivers. So this satellite is able to observe lake storage changes for very small lakes and reservoirs to the area about 1 hectare, which is about 100 meter by 100 meter in terms of size. There are millions of these kind of lakes and reservoirs. And as Sapna and Deborah said, a lot of them are distributed in Canada. And then they're also able to observe storage discharge in global rivers rather than about 50 meters to 100 meters. There are about hundreds of thousands of such rivers, also telling us how the sustainable water discharge is circulating around the Earth, and also giving us a better understanding of the observed water system, which will be the fundamentals for water conservation and management. Yeah, so, and this is basically my overview of how the Earth water cycle has been changing. And then I'm looking forward to additional discussions of the indications of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jida. That was wonderful. I love to see the power of remote sensing technologies to really understand these global responses. And I think it also, what it reminds me of is that we're all connected in many ways. So the water storage issues that someone in Africa might be experiencing could be analogous to issues affected in a different region. So it really makes us feel more connected with these different communities. So thank you for sharing your expertise.
Yeah, thank you, Sapna.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left, but before we move on to the closing remarks, I just wanted to take a few minutes to share some of the responses from the audience. So if this were my class, I would be giving A+ to the entire audience, because you've been so responsive with your comments, but also your questions. We're running out of time, but I just wanted to make sure that Richard could come up here and highlight some of the responses and maybe give us something to think about for future panels and courses, but also just for our own work. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Sapna. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
So thank you to all of the panelists and all of the participants. We had a really wonderful response from around the world, and it's so humbling to get such a quick response on so many important issues. And any of the remarks that we can't address today during the talk, please rest assured we're going to use them in some of our future materials and some of our future plans. So just a quick hit across some of the responses that we got. We had a respondent from Nigeria who highlighted water accessibility and availability. This was a common pattern across many of the responses. We have a comment from Bosnia and Herzegovina about water pollution. We heard from somebody in Myanmar who raised sanitation as one of the most critical issues in that region of the world. A respondent from Zimbabwe that indicated that water is only available twice per week. So that would be a very difficult and challenging circumstance for access for anybody who lives there. Some European responses, Switzerland, France, speaking about transboundary water management and sectoral prioritization of water use. These are some governance issues that we'll have to pay careful attention to. Of course, dry regions in the world like Afghanistan, water access in general was a big priority. We see a respondent from Kenya referring to scarcity and lack of enough clean water for plants, animals, and human persons. So this is a really great point. It's something we have to address, that we have these ecosystem ramifications, as well as difficulties and challenges for people trying to access water. We have a respondent from Toronto, Canada, talking about salt water, and the water's getting saltier as road salts that are applied are getting into the water systems, increasing the salinity of lakes. We see here a respondent from Georgetown and in Guyana. Some important challenges in my area were unclean tap water, high prices for water bills by water service providers, and very highly polluted rivers. We have a respondent from Indonesia referring to droughts in some periods due to El Nino and climate adversities. So we had many respondents who were referring to climate impacts and all the problems that we're going to see associated with our water systems as our climate systems change. And again, like in Toronto, we see in the GCC increased desalination. So issues with water salinity as we move forward is something that we'll all have to think about and address. We see other comments. This respondent in India talking about, even though fresh water is available in this person's particular region, there were neighboring regions that were declared dry recently, issues of low availability of groundwater, and then the slow recharge of these groundwater supplies. So there'll be low availability of drinking water in general. Climate change, again, in this region has had a severe impact. We see a respondent talking about various laws and governance issues dealing with water. This is another really important issue. We have a respondent from Tanzania talking about many people lacking access to safe water and sanitation. Again, another comment from India referring to polythene pollution in the water bodies. So due to this pollution, the water from the rivers and streams, which used to be crystal clear and fit for consumption, are no longer. So pollution issues across the world are going to be very important and something we have to think about and address.
Thank you, Richard, for highlighting some of the comments that were received, and thank you to the audience for providing those comments. I just wanted to take just a minute or two, bring back all of the panelists, if you could turn on your screens. And I guess I would like, some of the common issues that we've heard about are drought, water availability, and water quality. I think I would really appreciate your comments to these issues. Perhaps we can start with Governor Ole Lenku. What your reflections are about the issues affecting different regions in the world.
Sorry, the governor has had just to dash out because he had an appointment with the president, so he is not here.
Okay, thanks. Do you have a comment, being from Kenya and the issues that you've experienced?
Yes, I think generally we connect generally with the issues that the various speakers spoke about, and that Kenya as a country, but of course the governor spoke about issues in Kaijado, which continue to strain people and actually impeding the ability for people to make good livelihoods, and of course affecting the economic well-being of people of Kaijado.
Thank you for sharing that. And we heard from many residents of African countries highlighting some of the issues that the governor highlighted in his talk that they're facing similarly. Deborah, do you have any final comments?
Yes, thank you. I'll be brief. I think almost everything that was outlined, and I appreciate the summary. That's a lot of work to summarize that, is like every single one of those issues that was raised is not, the burdens are not equitably distributed. So there's still huge inequity in terms of everything that people talked about, drought or scarcity, or even access to technology to deal with challenges that different communities are facing. So I do want to highlight that. And the other thing I would say is almost every single what I call the disaster reports that come out, the IPCC reports, soon the World Water Report, it's going to come up. They all call for transformation. Business as usual, status quo is not working, not acceptable. And I think everybody showed that in their presentations. So we need to have imagination to think through, how's it going to look different? The governance, legal structures are not responding in the way, and to address, you know, what everyday, in people's everyday reality are facing. So there's definitely a scale component to this. So I think it's important to do the community work, whatever we want to call it, community sustainability work, and be able to scale that up. But there really needs to be broad scale transformation. But I'll stop there. There were great comments, and appreciate the summary that was done, because it's hard to address any one of them in like 60 seconds. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. And finally, Jida.
Yeah, thank you for the questions for the audience, and thanks for the summary. So, so you know that we have hydrology is dealing with water resources, but you know, eventually water resources are assets, and there are resources. Eventually, we have to redistribute them to be accessible to the societies. So when we are on the one hand, we understand how waters are in water storages and well, water discharge is changing. It's also very important to really emphasize on, is the water resource accessible to people? And for some of the water disasters and water crises, oftentimes, you know, it's climate related, but oftentimes also because of lacking, you know, the sufficient infrastructure to access clean and potable water. And then we're going to have a more uncertain climate in the next century or so. So even though we are having more precipitation as a whole because of warming, and then we're going to have more intense droughts and more intense precipitation, basically more extremes. So this really make it even more important that for the global south, making sure sustaining the water infrastructure, making sure the citizens have reliable water accessibility is very crucially important. And sometimes they often need help from each other, from more developed countries and investments, and also policy and management as well.
Thank you, Jida. And another issue that came up a lot during the question and answer, as well as the poll responses, was the issue of conflict and water insecurity, and how it's water insecurity is amplified during times of war. And so just to this is a huge issue. It's a humanitarian issue. And our next panel on March 22nd, Friday, March 22nd, actually will look at in detail the link between water and peace and conflict, as the World Water Day theme this year is water and peace. So we hope that you'll be able to join us next Friday as well. I would like to thank all of the panelists for sharing their wisdom and their expertise with us today, to the audience for sharing your expertise with us today, so that we can learn from you about the water insecurity affecting your regions. And I will pass it off to President Rhonda Lenton for some final remarks to close out our session today.
You know, I know that we're over time, so I just wanted to thank you, Sapna, and the co-hosts, all of the panelists. It's really a fascinating panel on such an important topic, and I look forward to continuing for all of us to engage together. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, and have a great day, everybody.